Great. Good morning. Thanks again for having us here today to talk a little bit more about the Nutrition Evidence Library and how it was used with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So just as a brief reminder, the Nutrition Evidence Library, or NEL, is an entity that collaborates with leading scientists to conduct systematic reviews that will then be used to inform federal nutrition policies and programs. And it does have a dedicated federal staff who have experience both in reviewing and evaluating nutrition research as well as in systematic review methodology in general, who support the work of those experts that we're collaborating with to conduct the systematic reviews. And so last time we met, I went over the process that we use to conduct systematic reviews in a lot of detail. And so today, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and walk through a case study of one of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee systematic reviews, specifically the one that they did looking at dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer. And so just before I dive into the case study, I just wanted to show this slide again. It looks familiar probably from the last time we met. Provides a kind of an overview snapshot of the process that we use to conduct systematic reviews. But again, keeping in mind that the process is designed to be very protocol driven, to minimize bias, be very transparent, and make sure that we do have high quality systematic reviews available to inform US dietary guidance. So each of the systematic reviews we do is done in close collaboration with a group of leading scientists, primarily the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And a key premise of our work with the committee is that they make all substantive decisions throughout the process. And NEL staff is really there to ensure that they're adhering to our established methodology, as well as to help them execute the decisions that they're making along the way. As Barbara alluded to, the systematic review process is very labor intensive and can take quite a bit of time. So having that federal staff there to support the decisions that are made and execute those decisions made by the committee is really critical to making sure that the committee is able to get multiple simultaneous systematic reviews done in that tight time frame that they have to work in. And as has been mentioned a few times, I think in this past round with the 2015 committee, after all was said and done with getting the topic nomination process accomplished, the subcommittees were left with about a year, a little under a year, to conduct all of the systematic reviews and other analyses that they were doing to inform their report. So now in the next several slides, I'm going to walk through each step of the process and illustrate how that process was executed with the dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer systematic review. So step one, the DGAC identifies topics and then develops questions and analytic frameworks that address those topics. So you've heard a lot about the topic nomination process already from Dr. Studi and Dr. Millen, and so where I'll be picking up is where they take that topic and the initial questions that were developed and then translate that into the actual systematic review questions and analytic framework for the work that they're doing. And so the committee works together. In this case, it was the subcommittee that was focused on dietary patterns to really go through all of those PICO elements. So really spend a lot of time up front discussing what the target population is, what is that intervention exposure, what is that comparator, a lot of which was discussed during the topic nomination process, but again, just small refinements at this point of the game. And then again, identifying those endpoint health outcomes that would really be the focus of their work. And they also did spend some time talking about key definitions for the work and identifying some potential key confounders that they'd be thinking about as they go through the process of reviewing and analyzing the evidence. And all aspects of the questions and the analytical framework come directly from the committee. Again, the NEL staff is really there to guide them through the process, facilitate the process, document the decisions that are being made, really to help ensure that they're making all the important decisions up front that will be needed for the subsequent steps of the process. So step two is the literature search, screening, and selection process. In this particular step, the DGAC starts by selecting inclusion-exclusion criteria a priori that will help then guide the NEL staff to conduct the literature search, screen the articles, and identify the appropriate and relevant articles that will be included in the systematic review. NEL does give the committee some standard inclusion-exclusion criteria to use as a starting point. Typically, these are around things like language, publication status, study design, health status of study subjects, and they're really given to the committee to use as a starting point. Committee is then free to totally expand, revise, and add to those criteria to really make a set of criteria a priori that are most appropriate for whatever systematic review they're working on. After those criteria are established, the NEL librarians will develop a search strategy that includes identification of the databases, the search terms, the search filters that will be used. That is also given to the DGAC to take a look at, review, and approve. That approved literature search is run, and then 2 NEL analysts will then independently screen all of the results, looking at full text, abstracts, and looking at titles, abstracts, and full text of all of the articles, measuring the articles against the inclusion criteria, essentially excluding any articles that aren't meeting the criteria that the DGAC had established. And then finally, end up with a list of the included articles as well as a very long list of all of the excluded articles with the rationale. And the DGAC is provided with all of that information to review and approve the final set of articles that they'll include in their review. So this slide just shows the main inclusion criteria that were developed by the 2015 committee around dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer. So they set criteria, for example, around study design. I think one of note for this particular review is that they chose to include nested case control studies. That's not a typical study design that we always include in NEL reviews, but the committee felt that it was an appropriate study design to be looking in the context of this particular question. They also set some criteria around the subject populations for the studies that they wanted to include. I think another one of note here is that second bullet, healthy or elevated chronic disease risk. So they were really focused on looking at studies that looked at risk of developing breast cancer. So they were not then including studies that may have included subjects who were diagnosed with breast cancer, or maybe looking at studies that were focused on risk of recurrence of breast cancer. They were really looking at developing primary risk of breast cancer is sort of the population of interest, the outcome of interest. And then they went on to establish some criteria around dropout rates for interventions, how they required the study to have defined and described dietary patterns, and then all the studies needed to be published in English in a peer-reviewed journal from January 2000 to when the search was run in January 2014. So this is just a snapshot of the search strategy that was developed for PubMed. Very similar search strategies were also developed for Cochrane, Embase, and Navigator, which are other search databases. And then this is just a snapshot of the screening process. So you can see that the NEL analysts started with almost 2,000 articles and then screened all of the titles, abstract, full text to come up with a final set of 25 studies that were looking at dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer, which met the inclusion criteria that the committee had established. And so that final list of 25 articles was provided to the committee along with that list of all of the references that were excluded so that they could take a look at the reference list and confirm, approve, and kind of come up with that final list of included articles that they then move into the next parts of the process and review. So step 3 is data extraction, risk of bias assessment. In this step, that data from each of the included studies is extracted. And the risk of bias or the internal validity of each article is assessed. And the committee is also active in this particular step in identifying upfront with the NEL analysts which data they would like extracted from each article. Really, it's trying to get the committee to think about what is the data that they need extracted in order to answer the systematic review question that they're answering. And so you can see some of the typical types of information. It's pretty standard and not surprising, the types of information that we are pulling from each article. And then the risk of bias is assessed using the NEL bias assessment tool as well for each of the articles. And while all of the data extraction and risk of bias assessment is done by NEL staff, the DGAC does also have an opportunity to review all of that data and sort of make sure that it's complete, it's consistent, and it's accurate. This is a little hard to read, but I think it represents what a snapshot of the extracted data actually looks like. It's laid out in a very large, extensive spreadsheet, and it's done in a very uniform and consistent way. So we find that that makes it a little bit easier for the committee to then more efficiently and quickly be able to look across studies and do the comparing and contrasting and combining of data. So step 4 is evidence description and synthesis. And at this point, the DGAC then reviews and synthesizes all of the evidence from the included studies in the review. And in order to do this, they're given that very large spreadsheet with all of the extracted data. They're also given all of the full text manuscripts as well. And they're also given a set of probing questions that are designed to sort of facilitate their review and analysis of the evidence. And the probing questions really get at what's in the 4 boxes at the bottom of the slide here. So asking questions about similarities and differences between the studies, both in terms of the methods and the results, factors that may be impacting those relationships, ask them to start identifying some of the overarching themes from the body of evidence, and then it also asks them to think about some of the gaps and limitations from the evidence overall. Now, in some cases, the DGAC members themselves would take that information and write up that synthesis. In other cases, they'd ask the NEL analyst to take that input and draft the synthesis. But in both cases, there are then extensive rounds of review where all of the members of the subcommittee can weigh in, review, and approve the final synthesis of the evidence that's written. And again, it's a little hard to illustrate what the synthesis actually looks like, but it typically is several pages of text with a lot of supporting tables, overview tables, that sort of thing. And really, it's organized in a way that provides transparency to the end users around what evidence was reviewed and details about that evidence that then contribute to the development of the conclusion statement and the final grade, which is what is done in the next step, step 5. And in this step, the DGAC drafts and grades a conclusion statement. And so as a reminder, the conclusion statement is a brief summary statement that answers the systematic review question, and then, which is a very iterative process where they'll go through many rounds of revision and discussion to make sure that the nuances of the evidence and that the complete body of evidence is really considered and reflected in the conclusions that are being drawn. And then once they've agreed on that conclusion statement, they go through the process of grading. So they're looking at these 5 elements that are shown on the slide here: internal validity, adequacy, consistency, impact, and generalizability, and weighing the evidence against all of those elements to come up with that final grade. So determining whether the evidence overall is strong, moderate, limited, or grade non-assignable. And again, that final grade is what communicates to policymakers and others the strength of the evidence that's underlying the conclusion statement that's been drawn for the particular systematic review question. And so this slide just shows the conclusion and grades that were developed for the dietary patterns in breast cancer systematic review. Again, you can see that it's an answer to the systematic review question. There's some indication of the strength of evidence in the text of the conclusion statement. It gets pretty specific about populations in this particular conclusion statement. And at the end, the committee actually decided to assign 2 grades to this particular conclusion statement. They felt that there was moderate strength of evidence to support the conclusions that they were drawing around dietary patterns and risk of postmenopausal breast cancer, but that the evidence was more limited when looking at the risk of premenopausal breast cancer risk. So they were really able to be sort of flexible and nuanced in how they drew the conclusion and then graded it for this particular systematic review. And then finally, the last step is the identification of research recommendations. And again, throughout the process, as the evidence is being discussed and deliberated, lots of research gaps and limitations tend to come up, and so that at the end of the day, they're compiled either by a DGAC or the NEL analysts who are supporting their work to come up with a list of all of those research recommendations and the rationale for why the research is needed around a particular topic. And so the recommendations on this slide are the ones that apply directly to dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer. So that's where I'll stop today, but I did want to note that there's a link here at the bottom of the slide that directs you straight to the full systematic review on dietary patterns and risk of breast cancer. And again, all of the reviews that were conducted by both the 2010 and 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee are all located on nel.gov. I'd be happy to help you navigate the website if you have questions about it, but that's where all the full shebang are located. And with that, I think we'll answer questions.
Thank you very much.